It was in the mist-laden melancholy of an October morning that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street. Outside, the fog had drawn its woolen veil across the streets of London, muffling the sound of hooves and the clatter of iron shoes upon cobblestones. The lamplighter had barely completed his rounds, and the oily gaslight still cast a flickering glow over the parlour, illuminating the ordered chaos of Holmes's many pursuits. He was in one of his moods, reclined on the settee with fingers steepled beneath his chin and eyes half shut in what any casual observer might have mistaken for sleep. Yet I knew better. This was his contemplative state, one in which the machinery of that remarkable mind ticked away at full steam, fed by an unseen question or anomaly. A half-smoked pipe lay neglected in the ashtray. A monograph on the ancient coinage of Syria rested upon the Persian rug, where it had evidently slid from his lap. I was perusing the morning edition of the Times, having finished the crossword and turned to the obituaries out of sheer ennui, when a sharp rap at the door broke the stillness. Mrs. Hudson, prompt as ever, showed in a gentleman whose countenance bore the unmistakable imprint of distress, his pallor unnatural, his breath shallow with barely contained agitation. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, as though doubting even the certainty of his destination. Holmes opened one eye, nodded once, and gestured to the empty armchair across from him. "I am. Pray take a seat, and if you value clarity, begin at the beginning." The man did so with the air of one who has already rehearsed his tale a dozen times in his own mind, yet remains uncertain of how it will be received. "My name is Horace Pendlebury. I am, or rather was, secretary to the late Sir Clement Ashe of Epsom. I come to you regarding a document of some peculiarity, a last will and testament which Sir Clement signed not 2 weeks before his sudden death." Holmes sat upright at once. "A will, you say, and you were present at the signing?" "Yes, indeed. I drafted the document myself under Sir Clement's instruction, but when the lawyers examined it yesterday, they found something quite irregular." I leaned forward, drawn in despite myself. Holmes reached for a notepad without being asked. "Go on," he said. "What was the irregularity?" Mr. Pendlebury hesitated. "The signature. Sir Clement's signature was too long, precisely 3 inches longer than any other known specimen." "Too long?" I repeated. Holmes' eyes lit up. "Most intriguing. Do continue." Pendlebury drew from his pocket a folded sheet of legal parchment, its seal intact. "The lawyers measured it, you see. Sir Clement's normal signature fits well within the space allotted on ledgers and correspondence. But this one, dated October 3rd, stretches across the bottom of the page. And that is not all." He unfolded the paper with trembling hands. "There is an additional ink stroke at the end, almost as though someone hesitated or embellished. It is not like him." Holmes examined the signature with his magnifying lens, his features unreadable. "I presume," he said at length, "that there are interested parties who stand to benefit or lose considerably from this document." Pendlebury nodded. Sir Clement had no children, and his only living relative, a niece by marriage, Miss Clara Whittingham, was disinherited in favor of a charitable trust. She is, as you may imagine, quite embittered. Holmes tapped the edge of the document with a long forefinger. "And the signature, is it confirmed to be in Sir Clement's hand?" "That is the mystery," Pendlebury replied. "At first glance, yes. But those who knew him best claim it appears strained, as though written under duress or by someone attempting an imitation." Watson could not contain his curiosity. But wouldn't a handwriting expert resolve the matter easily? "That is what we hoped," said Pendlebury. "But the expert consulted by the family solicitor, Mr. Vaughan at Mortimer and Peabody, declared it genuine, and yet something about it continues to gnaw at me." Holmes turned the document sideways, observing the ink trail as if it were a map to some hidden land. 3 inches too long, he murmured. A man's signature is like his gait, alterable only with effort or intent. Tell me, was the signing witnessed? Yes. Myself, the butler Hawkins, and Miss Whittingham herself. And all 3 agreed he was lucid at the time? Lucid, but unusually quiet. I recall now that he signed the paper without a word, then looked up and said, "May it stand." Rather dramatic, but it struck me as odd. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the fireplace, his silhouette flickering in the firelight. "Mr. Pendlebury, would you object if I were to visit Sir Clement's residence?" "Not at all," the man replied, relief flooding his features. "If you could come to Epsom tomorrow morning, I shall ensure the household is informed." "Excellent. And bring me, if you please, a specimen of Sir Clement's earlier signatures. Letters, bank drafts, anything of that sort." As Pendlebury stood to leave, Holmes added one final question. Was Sir Clement's death expected? Pendlebury hesitated, then answered. He had been suffering from minor heart ailments, but nothing alarming. He died in his sleep a week after signing the will. Holmes gave a tight nod. "Very well, we shall call upon you by 10. After the man departed, Holmes turned to me with a gleam of anticipation in his eye. "What do you make of it, Watson?" I shrugged. "A long signature? Perhaps a sentimental flourish? Or the product of age and infirmity?" Holmes shook his head. "No, my dear fellow. There is design in the distortion. The length of that line may yet trace the outline of a very deliberate deception." And with that cryptic remark, he returned to his chair and relit his pipe, the strange document still clasped between his fingers as the morning fog thickened outside our window. The following morning found us aboard the 8:30 train to Epsom, the countryside slipping past in hues of damp ochre and rust beneath a perpetually overcast sky. Holmes was uncommonly silent, his long fingers laced in front of him as he stared absently through the rain-speckled window. I, for my part, busied myself with the notes I had jotted down from Mr. Pendlebury's visit, trying to align the peculiarities of the case into some coherent frame. But every time I thought I saw a pattern, Holmes' voice echoed in my mind. There is design in the distortion, and I found myself back at the beginning. Our arrival at the modest Epsom station was uneventful, though Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the platform as if expecting some silent figure to emerge from the shadows. A tidy brougham awaited us, and within minutes we were conveyed through the narrow, winding lanes to a stately Georgian residence set behind a wrought-iron gate. Ashcroft House, as Mr. Pendlebury had called it, had the air of faded grandeur, a place not in disrepair, but somehow weary with age. Horace Pendlebury himself greeted us on the front steps, his expression still marked by nervous vigilance. "Gentlemen," he said, ushering us inside, "thank you for coming. Miss Whittingham is not in the house at present. She's gone into town for the day, and I thought it best not to inform her of your visit just yet." "Very wise," Holmes replied. "I'd prefer an unclouded survey of the environment." We were led into the late Sir Clement's study, a large room with dark walnut bookcases, a heavy mahogany writing desk, and a tall mullioned window that overlooked a garden now surrendering to the decay of autumn. The fire had been lit recently, and the room bore the quiet stillness of a place that had once been lived in and now lay in quiet retreat from the world. "This is where the will was signed," Pendlebury said, pointing to the desk. "October 3rd, just past 11 in the morning." Holmes moved slowly about the room, taking in each object with his peculiar intensity. His gaze lingered on the inkstand, the carpet beneath the desk, and finally the chair itself, a large leather affair with worn arms. "Was this the chair Sir Clement sat in when he signed?" "Yes, precisely." Holmes examined the inkstand next, lifting the glass well and inspecting the dried residue with a frown. "This ink is of decent quality," he murmured. but not freshly supplied? Tell me, Mr. Pendlebury, was the pen used Sir Clement's own? Yes, it was his usual fountain pen. Here, I'll fetch it. He crossed to a small drawer in a side cabinet and returned with a silver-plated pen, which Holmes accepted with delicate fingers. He turned it over once, twice, then uncapped it and examined the nib beneath the magnifier from his coat pocket. "No residue," he murmured. "It has not been cleaned properly since its last use." Watson, ever the observer of Holmes's methods, ventured a question. "Is that significant?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "It might be, Watson. Pens, like people, leave behind little betrayals. If this pen was last used on October 3rd and not afterward, the dried ink may yet yield a trace of its color, viscosity, or impurities." "Then you suspect the signature was forged?" I asked, lowering my voice. "I suspect nothing. I observe." He handed the pen back to Pendlebury. "You say 3 individuals witnessed the signing, yourself, the butler Hawkins, and Miss Whittingham." "Correct. Where were they standing?" Pendlebury gestured. "I stood to the left of Sir Clement, near the desk. Hawkins was by the door, and Miss Whittingham sat across the room, there, by the fireplace." Holmes crossed to the spot and stood with hands clasped behind his back. She would have had a clear view, yet at some distance. "Tell me, was there any conversation before the signing?" "Only a brief instruction from Sir Clement. He said, 'Let it be done,' and witnessed without delay. That was all." Holmes turned sharply. A man does not revise his will without inner turmoil. Did he appear agitated? Pendlebury considered. Not outwardly, but he was pale and seemed tired. Holmes nodded and paced slowly back to the desk. "And Miss Whittingham, how did she react?" "She signed the witness statement, then left the room immediately. I remember her hand trembled slightly, but she said nothing." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Now, about Sir Clement's handwriting. Did you bring samples?" Pendlebury produced a folder and handed it to Holmes, who spread the papers out upon the desk. There were bank drafts, letters, and 2 earlier versions of Sir Clement's will. Holmes studied each with minute care, his lens never straying far from his eye. At last he pointed. "Here, observe the looping of the letter H in his surname. It terminates sharply in every specimen except this most recent one. In the contested document, the loop extends and wavers unnaturally. Also, the spacing of the letters grows inconsistent." I peered closer. "It's subtle." "Indeed, but so is forgery, when well executed. Now I require the witness statements." Pendlebury retrieved another file and passed it to Holmes. "Curious," he said after a moment. "Miss Whittingham signed in full. Clara Evelyn Whittingham, a flourish not previously seen in these other house records where she signed only C.E. Whittingham. Why the sudden formality, I wonder?" At that moment there came a soft knock at the study door. The butler, Hawkins, entered, a man in his late 60s, stiff with propriety, yet alert. "You wish to see me, sir?" "Yes," Holmes said without turning. "I am told you witnessed the signing of Sir Clement's final will." "I did, sir. Stood by the door the whole time." "And did anything strike you as unusual?" The old man hesitated. "Only one thing. Sir Clement always used a blotter after signing documents. He was fussy that way, didn't like smudges. But this time he did not. Signed the paper, then handed it off." Holmes turned swiftly. "No blotter used? Are you certain?" "Quite, sir. I remember it because I had the blotter in my hand, but he waved it away." Holmes' expression darkened slightly, and he motioned for Hawkins to leave. When the door closed again, he turned to me with sudden animation. "Watson, do you recall the length of the signature?" "Yes, Mr. Pendlebury said it was 3 inches longer than normal." "Precisely. And now we learn no blotter was used, though the ink appears unfaded. and the pen has not been cleaned since." I blinked. "Are you suggesting the document may not have been signed here at all?" Holmes only smiled. "Not yet. But I'm suggesting that something about the moment of signing was staged. The pen, the witnesses, the position in the room, each part may be accurate, yet the sum does not ring true." Pendlebury, now visibly agitated, asked in a hushed tone, "Then you believe it was forged?" Holmes returned the papers to their folder and replaced them gently on the desk. "I believe, Mr. Pendlebury," he said, "that someone went to great lengths to make it appear genuine, and that in itself is the greatest clue of all." He turned toward the window and looked out across the withered garden. "But to know for certain, we must first examine the scene of the departure, the room in which Sir Clement was found dead." Pendlebury hesitated. "Very well. But I warn you, there was nothing out of place. The doctor said it was a peaceful passing." Holmes's eyes were unreadable. "All the more reason to look." And with that, we followed him from the study, the air thick with the weight of unasked questions. The corridor that led us to the late Sir Clement Ash's bedchamber was wide, yet dim despite its size, with narrow windows on one side veiled by drawn lace curtains. The hush that fell upon us as we ascended the staircase and followed Mr. Pendlebury's slow tread seemed to deepen with each step, as though the very walls retained the solemnity of the man's final moments. Holmes moved ahead of me, his gaze scanning not just our surroundings, but the spaces between, the corners where shadow pooled, the faint impressions upon the carpeting, and the subtle scratches near the brass handle of the door we now stood before. "This room has remained undisturbed since Sir Clement's passing?" Holmes inquired. "Almost entirely," Pendlebury replied. "The maid enters once a week to dust, but otherwise it has been left just as it was on the morning of October 10th. Holmes nodded once, and the door was opened. The chamber within was modestly furnished, though still grand in a manner befitting a man of wealth and status. Heavy curtains framed the windows, allowing only a muted grey light to seep through. An oak wardrobe stood sentinel near the far wall, and a large canopy bed occupied the centre, its blankets folded neatly at the foot. The scent of lavender and age hung faintly in the air, along with something else, perhaps camphor or dried orange peel. Holmes paused on the threshold, his eyes drinking in the scene before setting foot inside. I watched as he performed his familiar slow circuit of the room, gliding past the hearth and peering behind the screen that concealed the washstand. He touched nothing, merely observed. "This is the bed in which Sir Clement died?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Pendlebury confirmed. "The housekeeper found him unresponsive just after 7 in the morning. Dr. Langley was called immediately and declared it heart failure, natural causes." "Was the body removed at once?" "Dr. Langley instructed that it not be disturbed until after midday. It remained here until the undertakers arrived that afternoon." Holmes approached the bed, lowering himself to his haunches. He examined the area beneath the headboard, then tilted his head slightly and gestured for me to join him. "Watson, observe the carpet fibers here. Slightly compressed, wouldn't you say? Almost as if someone stood in that position for a length of time, long enough to leave an impression." I knelt beside him. "Yes, flattened somewhat, but that could have been the maid." Holmes looked up at Pendlebury. "You said the maid only dusts lightly once a week. When did she last come in?" "Yesterday morning." Holmes tapped his fingers on the edge of the bed frame. "And yet this indentation appears fresher than that. I would wager it is less than 48 hours old." "Then someone entered the room recently?" I asked. "Precisely. Perhaps someone with a reason to stand in quiet contemplation at the place where Sir Clement died, or someone searching for something." He rose and paced toward the bedside table, which bore a silver-framed photograph, a crystal carafe of water, and a closed drawer. Without opening anything, he simply bent to inspect the underside of the table's drawer and then stepped back. Pendlebury, was anything taken from this room after Sir Clement's death? No personal effects were removed, he replied. At least none that I am aware of. Holmes nodded toward the wardrobe. And his clothing? Left untouched, except for a black frock coat that Miss Whittingham had taken for his burial. Holmes turned to me with a raised brow. Watson, remember that. He moved on to the fireplace, where a few charred bits of paper remained in the grate. Holmes crouched low, examining the remnants with such absorption that I dared not disturb him. When he rose again, a small smudge of soot marred his fingertip. Someone burned something here, he muttered, but did so carelessly. There is not enough ash to account for a letter or a legal document, but sufficient to suggest a page of notes, perhaps a diary entry or a list. Pendlebury's brow furrowed. Do you think it was Sir Clement who burned it? That is the question, isn't it? Was it his hand or someone else's? The timing is critical. We shall ask Mrs. Halifax, the housekeeper. She was summoned without delay, a kindly woman in her 60s with a face worn by service and sorrow. Yes, Mr. Holmes, she asked, clasping her hands before her. Mrs. Halifax, Holmes began gently, did you notice anything unusual on the morning Sir Clement was found? She blinked rapidly. No, sir, just that he didn't ring for his tea. I went in and found him, lying so still. I knew at once. Did anyone else enter the room before the doctor arrived? No, sir, not to my knowledge. Holmes stepped forward. And has anyone been in since? She paused. Well, Miss Whittingham asked to come in 3 days ago. Said she wanted to retrieve a book that belonged to her uncle. I didn't think it would matter. Holmes gave no visible reaction, but I knew that, inwardly, this small detail had been marked and filed. What book was that? The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, sir. Old leather-bound volume with gold lettering. Sat right there on his bedside table. Holmes glanced toward the very table where no such book now lay. And she took nothing else? Not that I saw. She was only in for a minute or two. Holmes turned away, satisfied, and thanked her for her time. As she departed, he looked to Pendlebury. I should like to speak with Miss Whittingham at her earliest convenience. Will she be home by evening? She will. I'll arrange it. Excellent, said Holmes. And one final request. Would you accompany me to the village cemetery? Pendlebury's face registered confusion. The cemetery? Yes, Holmes said. I wish to see the grave of Sir Clement Ashe. With nothing further to do at the house for the moment, we set off once again. Holmes striding ahead with that familiar gait that suggested a mind hard at work. As we passed through the iron gate and into the path leading toward the village, I could not resist voicing my thoughts. Holmes, what can possibly be gleaned from a grave? He gave a thin smile. Sometimes, Watson, it is not the grave itself, but its surroundings. Who attends, who avoids, who leaves flowers, and who does not. The village cemetery was situated just beyond the parish church, a neatly kept enclosure flanked by rows of aged stones. The grave of Sir Clement Ashe was easy to locate, marked by a simple headstone of white marble, the inscription elegant and unembellished. Someone had left a single white rose in a slim vase at the base. Holmes studied the grave in silence, then turned slowly in a full circle, noting the other nearby plots, the direction of the path, and the sight lines from the churchyard entrance. He crouched beside the rose and gently lifted it. No card, he murmured, and freshly placed. Within the last 24 hours, I would wager. Would that be Miss Whittingham, do you think? I asked. Perhaps, he replied. Or someone else who wishes to be remembered without being noticed. He stood, brushing soil from his knee. Watson, the threads are beginning to draw together. The forged signature, the missing book, the unblotted ink. They each form part of a pattern. But there is still one crucial knot left to untangle. And what is that? He fixed me with a look as sharp as any blade. The question is not merely who forged the signature, but what, precisely, Sir Clement intended to sign when he picked up the pen. It was nearing 6 o'clock when we returned to Ashcroft House, the sun a faded ghost behind the veil of mist that had settled low upon the fields. Our shoes were heavy with damp earth, and Holmes had not spoken a word since leaving the cemetery. I knew the look upon his face well. Eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a contemplative line, the expression of a mind tightening the strands of a net around something only he could yet see. Mr. Pendlebury met us at the door with a subdued nod. "Miss Whittingham has returned," he informed us. "She is in the drawing-room. I have not mentioned the cemetery." "Quite right," Holmes murmured. "Allow us to speak to her alone. Watson, observe carefully. This interview may turn upon the smallest of hesitations." We were shown into a room of delicate pastels and muted light, with pale green walls and framed lithographs of alpine landscapes. Clara Whittingham stood by the hearth, her figure tall and poised, though there was a rigidity to her bearing that spoke more of pride than serenity. She was perhaps 30, with dark auburn hair pinned back neatly, and a complexion of porcelain under which tension seemed to flicker. "Mr. Holmes," she said evenly. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. I was told you're investigating the matter of my uncle's will." Holmes offered a bow. "Merely inquiring into certain inconsistencies. You understand, I hope, that our purpose is not to cast aspersions, but to illuminate." "That depends on where the illumination is directed," she replied, then gestured to a chair. "Please sit. If I can be of assistance, I shall do my best." We seated ourselves, and Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed not on her face but on her hands, folded neatly in her lap, the knuckles white. "You were present at the signing of the will on October 3rd. Began. Do you recall anything unusual about your uncle's demeanor that day?" She gave the faintest shrug. "He seemed tired, but not unwell. He spoke very little. I assumed he had thought long and hard before making such changes to his affairs." "You were not informed beforehand of his intention to exclude you from the inheritance?" Her eyes flashed for a moment. "Number Rye learned of it from the solicitor. I admit it came as a surprise." "But you did not contest the will?" "On what grounds would I? It was his right to dispose of his property as he wished." "A very measured answer," Holmes said softly. "And yet, not 2 weeks after that signing, Sir Clement was dead. Heart failure, they say. But you know he had no history of serious illness." "He was 67, she replied, "and his diet was rich. Sudden death is not so rare in such cases." "Indeed. Yet the detail that concerns me more is the book you retrieved from his bedroom. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius." She stiffened. "It was sentimental value, nothing more. He often read it aloud to me when I was younger. I asked for it out of remembrance." "A book with great philosophical weight," Holmes mused. "You retrieved it 3 days ago. Do you still have it?" She hesitated, then stood. "Yes. It's in the next room. Shall I fetch it?" "If you would be so kind." She exited without haste. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered, "Watch her hands when she returns. If the book was truly a sentimental relic, she will cradle it as such. If not—" Miss Whittingham returned moments later, the book in hand. She held it with her fingers pinched at the spine as though it were something delicate. Yes, but also something she did not wish to soil. Holmes accepted it, turning the worn cover and flipping through its pages slowly. About halfway through he paused. A slight indentation in the inner binding caught his eye, and he held the book toward the firelight. "Curious," he said. "A page once tucked here, perhaps. Torn or removed. Were there notes your uncle kept in this book?" She blinked. "Not that I know of. Perhaps a bookmark." "Possibly," Holmes murmured. "Do you recall when you last saw your uncle read this?" "It must have been several months before his death. and yet it was on his bedside table. He liked to keep it near, even if he wasn't actively reading it. Holmes closed the book and handed it back. "One last question, Miss Whittingham. On the day of the signing, you signed as a witness with your full name, Clara Evelyn Whittingham. Yet other records suggest you usually sign as C.E. Whittingham. May I ask why the change?" A flicker passed over her face. It felt appropriate. A formal document. I thought to honor the occasion with a complete signature. Holmes nodded gravely. "Very reasonable. Thank you, Miss Whittingham. That will be all for now." She inclined her head, but there was a tension in her step as she left the room, as though she had entered wearing a mask and now feared it might slip. When the door closed behind her, I turned to Holmes at once. "Well?" "She lies," he said simply, and not skillfully. "About what in particular?" "About everything that matters. Her lack of emotion toward the book, the inconsistency of her signature, the missing page, each one a thread. And consider this, if the will was forged, then someone had access to Sir Clement's pen, his handwriting, and a compelling reason to alter his testament. She had all three. But the handwriting expert declared the will genuine. A handwriting expert can be deceived when given sufficient material. Sir Clement's prior documents would have been readily available to a close relation, and Miss Whittingham is intelligent enough to study his script and imitate it, given time." "But the pen," I said. "It hadn't been cleaned." "Just so. It may have been used to forge the signature, then left to sit, untouched, to preserve the illusion that it was last used on that day. But the true signature, what if Sir Clement signed something else entirely, and the forger substituted the false will afterward?" My brow furrowed. "So the real question is, what did he actually sign?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly. The 3-inch anomaly," the added flourish, "may have been a telltale sign of distress, or perhaps a struggle to emulate his style under duress. Orient. Perhaps Sir Clement never signed it at all." At that moment there was a knock. Pendlebury entered with a note. "This just arrived, addressed to Miss Whittingham, but mistakenly left on the hall table. It's marked from the Mortimer and Peabody offices." Holmes took it, his eyes narrowing. "Ah," he said quietly. "Now the clock begins to strike." He turned to me. "Watson, the next move is no longer mine alone. There is someone else involved in this matter, someone yet unseen, and before this night is over, I believe they will make themselves known." Holmes held the envelope in his hands as though it were a ticking mechanism, his fingers grazing the seal with delicate precision. The note had been addressed to Miss Clara Whittingham, but by some twist of fate, or perhaps Providence, it had found its way into Holmes' possession first. He examined the paper, sniffed the ink, and studied the watermark before finally breaking the seal with the edge of his thumbnail. I leaned forward slightly, instinctively holding my breath. "Watson," he murmured, "do you recall my principle? When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Yes, of course. This letter may help us discard a few more impossibilities." He unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. "Mortimer and Peabody Solicitors, 20 Chancery Lane, London, October 15th. Dear Miss Whittingham, in response to your inquiry, we confirm that the sealed envelope you deposited with us on the afternoon of October 9th remains intact in our secure documents vault. As per your instructions, it shall only be opened in the event of a legal dispute over Sir Clement Ash's testament, or upon direct instruction from your person. Should circumstances change, we remain at your service. Yours faithfully, R. Vaughan, Esquire." Holmes read it again, silently this time, and then held the letter up to the lamplight before handing it to me. "A sealed envelope," I said slowly, "deposited the day before Sir Clement's death." "Indeed," Holmes said, rising and beginning to pace the length of the room. "We must ask ourselves 2 questions. What did Miss Whittingham place in that envelope, and why did she choose to safeguard it at a solicitor's office with such precise instructions? A threat of some kind? Possibly. Or a safeguard, a means of asserting her leverage if the will was contested. It implies foreknowledge of the will's contents before his death and before the will was made public. That would suggest she was involved in drafting it, or replacing it. Exactly. Now consider the date. October 9th. Sir Clement died on the 10th. If Clara feared the contents of that envelope being discovered, she would have no time to retrieve it before his death, and she made no mention of it during our interview. But that's not unusual, I argued. If the envelope contained something personal. Personal documents are rarely deposited under lock and legal instruction, Watson. They are hidden in drawers, not vaults. There was a knock at the door. Pendlebury entered again, hesitant. Pardon the interruption, but Inspector Lestrade has just arrived. He says he received a note requesting his presence and believes it came from you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's eyes sparkled with interest. Lestrade? That is earlier than expected. Show him at once. Moments later, the familiar figure of the inspector appeared in the doorway, his bowler hat slightly askew and a look of polite irritation crossing his narrow features. "Well, Holmes," he said without preamble, "I hope this is worth the journey. I was halfway through the Tarrant affair when this note arrived. Anonymous, mind you, claiming you had urgent evidence relating to the Ash will. I assumed it was you." "It was not," Holmes replied calmly. "Though I am most grateful that you came. It appears our mystery is gathering momentum." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "Then what's this about?" Holmes gestured for him to sit and passed him the letter from Mortimer and Peabody. Lestrade read it quickly, lips tightening. "This implies she had prior knowledge," he said. "And if that will is fraudulent?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. I suspect Miss Whittingham may have forged it. Perhaps not alone, but we cannot act yet. We lack definitive proof. She is clever and cautious, but perhaps not cautious enough." Lestrade frowned. "We'll need more than suspicion, Holmes. She's protected by the apparent legality of the document. No jury will entertain conjecture." "Which is why," Holmes replied, "I must ask you to do something both delicate and discreet. Return to London tonight and obtain a court order to examine the envelope under controlled conditions. We must not alert Miss Whittingham. If the envelope contains what I suspect, it will either confirm her guilt or expose a deeper player still." Lestrade nodded slowly. "And what do you suspect it contains?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "A copy of an earlier will, or a letter from Sir Clement, perhaps a confession, or a statement contradicting the document currently accepted. In either case, its timing and secrecy are suspect." Lestrade rose. "Very well, I'll leave at once." After he departed, Holmes returned to the hearth and lit a long match, using it to stir the coals. His expression was unreadable. "There is something else, Watson." I looked up. "Yes." He pointed to the embers. "Those burnt fragments I examined in Sir Clement's bedroom, I believe one was a torn page, yellowed and thick. Not from the will, but likely from a personal notebook. A diary, perhaps." I frowned. Destroyed by Clara. Or by someone else, to ensure no one read what was written in those final hours. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then footsteps approached once more, hurried, unfamiliar. A young footman entered, breathless. "Mr. Holmes, sir, there's a man at the kitchen entrance. Says he was a gardener here years ago, just returned from the colonies. Refuses to give a name, but says he has a message about the ink and the grave." Holmes stood at once, his coat already in his hand. "Watson, come. The game has turned." Together we followed the footman out through the servants' corridor, the evening air sharp against our faces. Behind the house, near the hedgerow where the garden faded into scrub land, a figure waited. He was tall, lean, with the stooped posture of hard work and travel, his coat dusty and boots caked with mud. "You're Holmes?" the man asked, his accent touched by years abroad. "I am," Holmes replied. The man reached into his coat and withdrew a crumpled envelope. "I kept this. Didn't know if it mattered. But I saw the grave, saw the rose, and I remembered the day he made me refill his ink. Said he had one last thing to put in order." Holmes took the envelope without a word, opening it under the moonlight. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, yellowed and folded. He read it slowly, then passed it to me. It was a short note in Sir Clement Ash's handwriting. "To be opened only in the event of my death. My true will lies in the red ledger beneath my study drawer. I fear I shall not live to witness justice, but let those who find this know the signature was never mine." My blood ran cold. Holmes folded the note carefully and looked the stranger in the eye. "You've just saved the truth from being buried forever." The night air was damp and heavy with the scent of loam as we re-entered Ashcroft House through the servants' entrance, the message from the mysterious gardener tucked securely inside Holmes's inner coat pocket. I'd seen Holmes excited before, elated by the scent of a chase, as it were, but this was something altogether different. His step was quick and clipped, his eyes aflame not only with the thrill of deduction, but with a quiet urgency I could not yet place. "Pendlebury," Holmes called as we crossed into the main hall. The secretary emerged almost at once from the dining room, a folded sheaf of papers in his hands. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I must have immediate access to Sir Clement's study, alone. There is something I believe may still lie hidden within the desk." Pendlebury looked puzzled. "You've already examined it earlier today." Holmes turned without answering and strode toward the study, his coat swinging behind him. We followed, and once the heavy door was closed behind us, Holmes moved to the desk and knelt beside it. "Watson," he said, "note that Sir Clement's will was signed here. That is no longer in doubt. But what did he intend to sign before death interrupted, or before someone else intervened?" With that, he reached beneath the desk drawer and pressed lightly against the base. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a barely audible click, the false bottom gave way, and Holmes withdrew a slim, leather-bound ledger dyed in a deep oxblood red. It was covered in dust and bore no external markings. "Just as he said," Holmes murmured. "Hidden and forgotten, unless one knew precisely where to look." He placed the ledger on the desk and opened it. The pages were numbered, filled in a dense but tidy hand. Sir Clement's own, judging by what I could see over Holmes's shoulder. The entries dated back nearly a year and detailed financial transactions, correspondence records, and personal reflections. But as Holmes flipped toward the final pages, he slowed. There, written in a noticeably shakier script, was an entry dated October 2nd. "Have drawn up a new will. Clara must not have it. She believes I am weak, but I have seen the letters she burned. She lies with a polished tongue and borrowed charm. I have instead decided to leave the estate in trust to the Royal Conservancy and to fund the school in Harrowgate. It is written and signed. Witnesses to come tomorrow." Holmes turned the page, revealing what appeared to be the first draft of the very will that was later contested. Identical in structure, except for one detail. At the bottom was Sir Clement's signature, consistent with the other specimens Holmes had reviewed earlier. Its size was modest. It was not by any measure 3 inches longer than expected. "Then this is the true will," I said, breath caught in my throat. "Signed before the document was tampered with." "Exactly," Holmes whispered, "and Clara never found this version." He flipped back a few pages and frowned. "What is it?" I asked. "Another entry. One I did not expect. October 1st. Pendlebury grows nervous. He suspects I've made changes. He asked this morning if Clara would be present for the witnessing. I said no. He smiled in a way I did not like. Holmes sat back in the chair, eyes narrowing. I had not counted on Pendlebury. "But he called you," I reminded him. "He brought us into the matter." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and perhaps he did so to steer suspicion in the right direction. But there are subtleties here, Watson. Perhaps he did not foresee that Clara would deposit a document at Mortimer and Peabody. Or perhaps the gardener's sudden return has shaken his confidence." Just then there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Halifax entered, visibly flustered. "Mr. Holmes, Miss Whittingham has taken the carriage and left the house. She didn't say where she was going." Holmes stood at once. "It is not difficult to guess. She's gone to Mortimer and Peabody to retrieve the sealed envelope before we can obtain a court order to inspect it." "But Lestrade is already en route," I said. "True. But if she arrives first and demands its destruction, or if someone within the firm is loyal to her, the document could vanish." Holmes turned to Pendlebury, who had just entered behind Mrs. Halifax. "Sir, I must insist that you summon the local constable. We may need him before this night is out." Pendlebury blinked. "Of course, but may I ask why?" Holmes stepped forward, holding the red ledger. "Because we are on the verge of proving that a conspiracy was undertaken to falsify a man's final wishes. And I believe you, Mr. Pendlebury, may know more than you have told us." Pendlebury paled. "That's absurd. I served Sir Clement faithfully for 12 years. Holmes did not raise his voice. "Then explain this." He opened the ledger to the October 1st entry and placed it in Pendlebury's hands. The man scanned it once, then twice, before his knees seemed to falter. He dropped into the nearest armchair, the color draining from his face. "I didn't know he wrote that," Pendlebury said softly. I admit, I feared Clara was influencing him. She would linger outside his door, listen through the keyhole. But I didn't forge the will. I swear to you, I didn't forge it." Holmes looked at him closely. "Did you see her with a copy of the original draft?" Pendlebury shook his head. "Number. But 2 days before the will was signed, she asked me peculiar questions about the signature, about how Sir Clement usually signed legal documents. At the time, I thought little of it." "That was your mistake," Holmes said. "She may not have forged the document alone. Tell me, who delivered the final version to the solicitor?" "I did. Sir Clement handed it to me directly after it was signed. It was in a sealed envelope, and I brought it to Mortimer and Peabody the next morning." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Then it was intercepted, or replaced before submission. Either she switched the contents, or you were given a false document without realizing it." Pendlebury ran a hand through his hair. "If that's true, then someone else had the real version." Holmes pointed to the ledger. "That someone was Sir Clement, and he hid it, anticipating just such a betrayal." A knock echoed again, this one harder and more urgent. A constable entered, escorted by Mrs. Halifax. "Evening, gentlemen," the officer said, looking between us. "Mr. Pendlebury sent for me." Holmes stepped forward, voice cool and resolute. "Constable, we may be on the verge of exposing a forged legal document and the unlawful alteration of a will. I will require your help in securing evidence before it can be destroyed." The constable nodded. "Understood." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you will remain here and ensure the ledger is protected. I'm going to London, to Mortimer and Peabody, before the hour grows too late. I intend to arrive before Miss Whittingham takes her final step. The truth, I believe, is now but minutes from the light." And with that, he swept from the room, cloak billowing behind him, the night once more folding around the silent brilliance of his purpose. London had never struck me as simultaneously asleep and alive as it did that night when Holmes, alone in a hired cab, descended upon Chancery Lane just shy of midnight. The gas lamps glimmered faintly through the fog. casting elongated shadows along the narrow pavements where clerks and barristers by day gave way to watchmen and the occasional hansom, rattling through like a phantom on a timetable known only to the nocturnal. Holmes leaned out of the carriage window as the cab drew up in front of number 20, the discreet offices of Mortimer and Peabody. The building was modest and respectable, its polished brass nameplate gleaming faintly above the dark oak door. Though the firm kept no overnight staff, a light still burned in a back room, and Holmes had no doubt as to whom it belonged. He disembarked and approached the entrance with his usual purposeful stride. With a gloved hand, he gave 3 precise knocks. Moments passed in silence until, eventually, a flicker of movement behind the frosted glass announced the approach of someone cautious. The door creaked open a hand's width, revealing a balding, sharp-nosed man with pince-nez perched precariously at the end of his nose. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, squinting through the dim. "Indeed. Mr. Vaughan, I presume?" The solicitor gave a curt nod, then stepped aside. "I was not expecting you tonight." "I imagine not, but it's tonight that matters. May I come in?" Vaughan hesitated a moment, then opened the door fully. "Very well. But I must remind you, sir, that any documents held in trust cannot be accessed without due process, unless, of course, there is cause to believe they've been compromised." Holmes stepped inside and removed his gloves slowly. "And what if I were to tell you, Mr. Vaughan, that a sealed envelope deposited here by Miss Clara Whittingham may contain evidence of a forgery, evidence intended to control the estate of the late Sir Clement Ashe under false pretenses?" The solicitor blinked rapidly. "That's an extraordinary claim." Holmes removed a folded sheet of paper from his coat, Lestrade's court order, freshly inked and bearing the magistrate's seal. "I anticipated your hesitation. Inspector Lestrade is en route, and I have brought a signed directive permitting examination of the sealed deposit, provided it is done in your presence and without removal from this office." Vaughan took the paper, read it in silence, then nodded grimly. "Follow me." The solicitor led Holmes through a narrow corridor lined with locked file drawers and into a reinforced chamber where important testaments and legal documents were kept under lock and key. A brass-latched cabinet stood in the far corner, its interior revealed by the turn of a key Vaughan removed from a chain around his neck. He reached inside and withdrew a sealed envelope, creamy parchment, sealed with violet wax, and addressed in Clara Whittingham's handwriting. Holmes examined it without touching. "May I?" he asked. Vaughan gave another nod, stepping aside. Holmes carefully sliced the seal with a letter opener from his coat pocket. He unfolded the contents slowly, aware that the moment demanded both precision and restraint. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, aged yet intact, bearing a familiar name. It was a copy of Sir Clement Ashe's will, but not the one the public had seen. Holmes scanned it swiftly. The bequest to Clara Whittingham was present, generous and sweeping, granting her full control of the estate. And the signature, he squinted. It was indeed in Sir Clement's hand, but something was amiss. Holmes tilted the paper and drew out a small magnifier. Under its lens, the ink of the signature shimmered differently than the rest of the document. 2 inks, 2 pens. The will had been written, it seemed, in one hand and at one time. But the signature, the mark that granted it legal authority, was in a fainter tone, laid down after the text had dried. Holmes's breath caught slightly. The trick was clever, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but not to him. "I see," he said aloud. Vaughan looked over. "Is it what you expected?" "In part. The text matches Sir Clement's previous will, except the date is changed. October 3rd, the day the false will was supposedly signed. But look here, Mr. Vaughan, this ink is not the same. The signature has been added after the body of the document was prepared, quite possibly traced." Vaughan paled. That's forgery, Mr. Holmes. Holmes replaced the paper inside the envelope. Not only forgery, deception orchestrated with care, and perhaps desperation. This copy was likely kept in reserve by Miss Whittingham. Should the original forged will be contested, she intended to present this one as evidence of her legitimacy. But it will not withstand scrutiny. There was a knock at the outer door. Sharp, impatient. Vaughan left to answer, and moments later, Inspector Lestrade entered the chamber, removing his hat with one hand and producing a small bundle of papers with the other. "Well, Holmes?" he asked. "Did we beat her to it?" "By perhaps 15 minutes, Holmes replied, "if she's even coming at all." "She's on her way," Lestrade said. "We received word from a cabman who picked her up near Epsom Station. She should be here shortly." Holmes handed him the opened envelope. "We've intercepted her plan. This document matches the contested will, but the signature was added later. I suspect she forged the main will using her uncle's stationery and had this version created as a backup in case of challenge." Lestrade exhaled. "You'll testify to this?" "Gladly." The doorbell rang again, this time more aggressively. Vaughan moved to open it. Clara Whittingham stepped into the office, her coat still damp from the fog, her gloves clenched in one hand. She froze as she saw Holmes, Lestrade, and the opened envelope in the solicitor's hand. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes, with the grace of a man not given to triumphal gloating, stepped forward. "Miss Whittingham," he said, "you have arrived too late, but perhaps just in time to explain yourself." Her expression shifted, defiance flickering into resignation and then something quieter. Weariness, perhaps. "So," she said, voice low, "it's over then." "That depends," Holmes replied, "on whether you acted alone." She did not speak. Lestrade stepped forward. "Miss Clara Whittingham, I'm placing you under temporary custody pending formal charges of document tampering, forgery, and the obstruction of a lawful inheritance. You may speak now, or you may wait for your solicitor." She nodded once. There's little point in denying it now. But before she could say more, Holmes raised a hand. "Miss Whittingham, you are not the only one with secrets. Before we conclude this night's business, I must ask, who helped you forge the will?" She hesitated, then looked down. "I did it myself," she said quietly. The rest was fear. Fear of losing everything. Holmes studied her a long moment, but said nothing further. Lestrade gestured for her to follow, and she did so, without protest. As they departed, Holmes turned once more to the open ledger in his mind, the invisible puzzle pieces he had assembled from ink, words, and silence. The signature had been 3 inches too long, but in the end, the deception had proven barely that wide. Dawn had just begun to unlace the fog from the rooftops of London when Holmes returned to Ashcroft House. He looked travel-worn but unsleeping, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat, as he dismounted from the cab that had brought him from Chancery Lane. The frost had turned the gravel path into a glistening stretch of glassy stones, and the first bird calls were only just breaking the long hush of the night. I met him at the doorway, having kept vigil in the study through the small hours. The red ledger, now locked securely in a drawer, had been untouched since he departed, and I'd spent the time rereading portions of it under the flickering lamplight, trying to see through Holmes's eyes. I saw resentment, concealed truths, and above all, fear. But I saw none of the sheer clarity Holmes so often seemed to draw from the same ink. "You have it?" I asked as I opened the door. "I have more than that," he said, stepping inside and pulling off his gloves. "Miss Whittingham has confessed to the forgery, albeit without naming any accomplice, and yet I believe she was not the sole architect of this deception." I led him back into the study. "Then who?" "Pendlebury." Holmes gave a non-committal grunt and moved to the fire, rubbing his hands before the faint glow. Pendlebury knew more than he admitted, but knowledge is not always complicated. He may have allowed himself to become a tool in someone else's scheme. I poured him a cup of black coffee from the silver pot Mrs. Halifax had brought in at dawn. He accepted it gratefully, though he took only a few sips before setting it aside, his attention once more on the room. "She was desperate," he murmured. "But desperation alone does not explain the careful execution of this forgery. She was deliberate, patient. The will was not merely changed, it was restructured, redacted, and reinforced with a secondary document, the false copy we found at the solicitor's. That suggests planning, and someone close by, someone with legal understanding, must have helped her shape it." He tapped the desk lightly. But the evidence she didn't account for was always here, hidden in the fibers of this house. There was a knock at the study door. It opened to reveal Mrs. Halifax once again, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "there's a man outside. Says he spoke to you last night." Holmes looked up. "The gardener?" "Yes, sir. He's back. Said he has something else. Didn't want to come in. He's waiting near the west hedge." Holmes stood immediately. "Come, Watson." The morning had brightened only slightly, the fog now broken into floating wisps clinging to the ground like reluctant spirits. We crossed through the rear garden and found the tall figure waiting by the hedgerow, a wool cap pulled low over his brow and his boots sunk slightly into the dewy grass. "Mr. Holmes," he said, touching the brim of his cap. "Didn't want to leave without saying one more thing." "Go on," Holmes said, standing still. The man reached into his coat and produced a weathered envelope, tied with twine. "Found this buried behind the old compost bin yesterday. Was clearing out weeds. Hadn't been touched in years. I didn't know what it was, not at first. But after seeing you last night, I figured you might want it." Holmes took the envelope gently. It was thick and brittle, the edges darkened with age. He opened it with the care of a man unwrapping a delicate artifact. Inside were 4 folded letters, all in Sir Clement Ash's hand. Holmes passed one to me while he read the others. The one I held was addressed to my solicitor, in the event of my death. I read quickly. It was a warning, written months before Sir Clement's death. I've become increasingly suspicious of Miss Whittingham's intentions. I've witnessed her speaking in hushed tones with my secretary, and I fear the two may be conspiring to alter my wishes. I intend to move my funds and draft a new testament, held in secret. Should I die unexpectedly, I request that my former drafts be examined and the authenticity of my final signature verified." Holmes had read his letters in silence, but now folded them and placed them back into the envelope. "Watson," he said calmly, "we have what we need. You believe Pendlebury was involved then?" "Number." "Worse. He was manipulated." He turned to the gardener. "You've done a great service, sir, one few others could have performed." The man nodded once and walked back into the mist, his figure swallowed by the hedgerow as though it had opened to take him. We returned to the study. Holmes laid out the new letters on the desk alongside the red ledger. For several minutes he said nothing, simply absorbing the weight of every line. "Miss Whittingham's plot was calculated," he finally said. But it began to unravel the moment her confidence exceeded her caution. The forged will, the backup copy, the secrecy of her sealed envelope, each step ensured her narrative held. But she underestimated the paper trail left behind. Sir Clement anticipated her. He suspected his trust was misplaced. And the real will? Still hidden, or possibly destroyed. But with the red ledger and these letters, we can prove his final intentions. They point toward his true beneficiaries and away from Miss Whittingham. A quiet knock interrupted our thoughts once more. Pendlebury entered, pale and stiff. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse, "I heard Miss Whittingham was taken into custody." Holmes studied him carefully. "She was. I never knew what she planned. I swear it." "I believe you," Holmes said. But you allowed too much to pass unquestioned. You delivered a will you haven't seen signed. You allowed her proximity to Sir Clement to cloud your duties." Pendlebury sank into the armchair near the hearth. I thought she loved him, or at the very least I believed she cared. But it was all theatre. She wanted the house, the money. I think she believed she was owed something for her years here. "She may have believed that," Holmes said quietly, "but belief is not law, nor is sentiment a substitute for justice." Pendlebury buried his face in his hands. "What will happen now?" Holmes stepped toward the fire. "That depends on the Crown. The evidence will be presented, and with the letters, ledger, and forged documents in hand, the case will be made. You are fortunate the law permits leniency for those misled, so long as they cooperate in full." Pendlebury looked up, hollow-eyed. "I will." Holmes nodded. "Then we begin the process of righting what was almost irreparably wrong." As the light continued to rise through the windows, Holmes turned back to me, his voice low. "Deceit often lies not in bold strokes, Watson, but in the details. The way ink sits differently on a page, the angle of a pen held too tightly, or a signature that runs a few inches too long. It's not the grand lie that betrays the truth, but the quiet deviation from habit." I nodded, deeply moved by the quiet justice he had unearthed. And so, as Ashcroft House stirred fully to life and its secrets drew nearer to sunlight, I realized that the case, though intricate, had never been about the length of a signature alone, but about the weight of character beneath the name. It was the day after Holmes had uncovered the letters buried behind the compost heap that we received an unexpected visitor at Ashcroft House. The revelations of the previous 48 hours had moved with a kind of relentless gravity, pulling every concealed truth from its hiding place and laying it bare. Clara Whittingham was now in custody in London, the ledger had been secured with Inspector Lestrade, and Pendlebury had retired to his room, claiming a need for rest. Holmes, meanwhile, showed no sign of slowing. I found him in the morning light by the rear parlor window, standing motionless, his gaze fixed on the skeletal trees beyond the garden. A plate of untouched breakfast sat on the table nearby, the tea long gone cold. His mind, I knew, was no longer within the confines of the house. It had already returned to the problem that never truly left him. "I was thinking," I said gently, "that the case might be concluded. Clara has confessed, the documents are secured, and the red ledger will hold up to scrutiny." Holmes gave no reply for several moments. Then he spoke quietly. "And yet I am unsatisfied." I turned toward him. "In what way?" She confessed, yes, but did so too readily. Her plan was precise and methodical. A woman capable of drafting a forged will with such composure does not confess without a deeper reason. She sacrificed herself to protect someone else. I frowned. "But whom?" "Pendlebury." "No," Holmes said with certainty. "He was merely her shadow. She had another ally, one more deliberate, someone who remained hidden." At that very moment, Mrs. Halifax knocked at the door, stepping in with her usual calm deference. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman at the door asking to speak with you. Wouldn't give his name." Holmes turned instantly. "What does he look like?" "Taller than average, pale eyes, clean coat, but his boots are caked in mud. Accent like he's from the north." Holmes looked at me. "The other player enters the game." I followed him into the hallway, and there, standing as if perfectly at ease despite the tense air, was a man of about 40, narrow in build, with an intelligent sharpness in his eye, and the faint smirk of one who considers himself very nearly invulnerable. "Mr. Holmes," he said, tipping his hat without removing it. "I've come to discuss the business of Sir Clement Ash. I believe you've taken quite an interest." Holmes didn't offer a handshake. "That would depend, sir, on whether you are here to clarify the truth, or to obscure it further." The man smiled faintly. "Let's call it a bit of both." We led him to the study, where Holmes motioned for him to sit. I remained near the door. "You're not a solicitor," Holmes began. "You're not family, and your boots tell me you've come from the northeast trail of the estate, near the copse, not the carriage road. That's not the path of a first-time visitor. You know this property?" The man nodded. "I should. I grew up in the next village, spent years away, colonial interests, legal affairs, and so on. But I kept watch from a distance." "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Lavington." Holmes froze for half a breath, then gave a slow nod. "Of course. Sir Clement's former legal advisor. You resigned rather suddenly 2 years ago, did you not?" "I did," said Lavington. "Clara urged him to dismiss me, said I was interfering in family matters. She never liked that I questioned her motives." "And now you've returned," Holmes murmured. "The timing is impeccable." "I received word through a mutual acquaintance, a gardener, in fact, that something was amiss. I made inquiries, and what I discovered confirmed my worst suspicions." "You helped her," Holmes said. "It was not a question." Lavington's mouth twitched. "Not as you might think. I warned her, advised her to walk away. She did not listen, but I did not forge anything." "No," Holmes said slowly. "But you drafted the structure of the false will. She lacked the language, the legal syntax. You gave her the bones. She added the skin." Lavington was silent. "She protected you," Holmes went on. "She gave herself up before your name could enter the equation." Lavington stood, pacing slowly before the hearth. "I wanted to help her at first. I believed she was wronged, promised more than she was given. But then I saw how far she was willing to go. She crossed the line, and I let her. I walked away before the signature was placed, and that, Mr. Holmes, is what separates guilt from implication." Holmes approached him now, calm and cold. "You're wrong. What separates guilt from implication is whether one acted to correct a wrong once they saw it. You've done nothing of the sort." Lavington turned, eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me?" "A statement," Holmes said. "In writing. Confirming that Clara consulted you in the weeks leading up to the signing, that you discussed will be structures, that she asked for language that would supersede prior versions. And if I refuse?" Holmes stepped closer. "Then I will take your silence as a sign of complicity. I have your name, your history, your handwriting on earlier drafts from Sir Clement's affairs. The court will welcome your testimony, or wonder why it was withheld." Lavington's face twitched once and he sank into the armchair. "She didn't deserve to go to prison alone," he said at last. "I'll write it." Holmes nodded once. "Good. The truth, Mr. Lavington, always finds its own echo." He left the study not long after, having committed to providing the affidavit by day's end. Holmes watched him go with no satisfaction, only the quiet vigilance of a man who had seen one final card fall into place. Later that evening, with the fire burning low and the storm clouds beginning to roll in from the hills beyond Epsom, Holmes and I sat alone in the study once more. The house had grown still again, but not in the way it had been when we arrived. Now it was the stillness of closure, of air cleared, of ghosts sent properly to rest. "So it was Lavington," I said, sipping the last of the brandy. "Yes," Holmes murmured. "The guiding hand behind Clara's scheme. She had the ambition, he had the knowledge. Together, they nearly succeeded. And yet he came back." "Guilt," Holmes said simply. He may have thought himself protected by technicality, but guilt has a way of summoning a man back to the scene, even when he thinks he's escaped it. We fell into a comfortable silence, the fire crackling between us. After some time, Holmes leaned back and looked out the window, the darkness beyond now absolute. "There's something I've always found curious, Watson." "What's that?" "When a man forges a will, he imitates handwriting, legal phrases, and sealing methods. but he rarely thinks to imitate motive. And that, more than any signature, is what reveals him. He closed his eyes, and for once I saw the storm in his mind settle, as though even he allowed the case to fade into memory. Yet I knew that in some recess of his thoughts, the puzzle still lingered. Completed perhaps, but never quite forgotten. It was 4 days after the arrest of Clara Whittingham, and 2 since Thomas Lavington's written statement had arrived at Scotland Yard, signed and delivered without flourish. In the realm of criminal law, matters moved slowly, like a barge on a silted river. But in our own tight circle, the case had reached a place of measured finality. The documents had been catalogued. The red ledger had been authenticated. The notes found behind the compost heap, the gardener's testimony, and the oddities surrounding the false signature, all had been compiled into a case Lestrade called ironclad and elegantly damning. Yet Holmes remained at Ashcroft House longer than I expected. We had been invited to stay until the conclusion of the formal proceedings, and though I had assumed Holmes would grow restless, he instead became curiously rooted, wandering the grounds, sitting for long stretches in the library, even asking Mrs. Halifax questions about Sir Clement's childhood, preferences, and old habits. There was something deeply reflective in his movements, and on the 5th morning, I found him alone in the conservatory, perched on a wrought-iron bench among the late chrysanthemums. He looked up as I entered, then returned his gaze to the streaks of light filtering through the frost-rimmed glass. "Have you considered," he asked without turning, "why Sir Clement hid the red ledger at all?" "He distrusted Clara," I replied. "He feared she would tamper with his affairs, and rightfully so." Holmes nodded. "But it's more than that. He also did not trust the process. He understood that a legal will, witnessed or not, could be circumvented by cleverer hands. So he placed his final intentions not in the official record, but in the record of his own making. His ledger was his conscience." He rose and walked slowly toward a tall plant whose leaves had begun to curl from the cold. "Watson, men of position rarely think they will die abruptly. Yet Sir Clement behaved as if the end might come at any hour. He changed his testament, he removed Clara from the estate, and he wrote notes warning others of betrayal. He even left that strange, vague message with the gardener, about the ink and the grave." "You think he knew," I asked, "that he would be killed?" Holmes turned to me then. "I think he suspected it was a possibility. But the doctor found no signs of poisoning. But poisoning is only one form of murder, and not all deaths are immediate. Sometimes the body is made to surrender not by force or substance, but by manipulation of time and circumstance." He began pacing. "We assume Clara altered the will after his death. But what if the sequence was subtler? What if the forged will was presented while Sir Clement was still alive, but sedated, confused, or physically weakened?" I felt a chill, though the room was warm. That would explain the strange signature, 3 inches too long, a trembling hand. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And we know from the butler's account that Sir Clement refused the blotter, an action unlike him. He may not have even known what he was signing." My thoughts raced. Then the forgery wasn't a complete fabrication. It was a manipulation. Clara and Lavington prepared the document and placed it before him, counting on his feebleness to carry it through. "And the witnesses?" Holmes asked. Hawkins, the butler, didn't seem to suspect anything. Pendlebury was too eager to be useful. And Clara orchestrated the moment like a stage play. Holmes walked to the small writing table in the corner of the conservatory. He opened the drawer and withdrew a page from a notepad, then sat and wrote something quickly with his own fountain pen. I watched as he carefully exaggerated the last few letters of his name, letting the line extend across the page. "It's a strain," he said. "Unnatural. A man in poor health, seated awkwardly, his arm unsupported, would produce precisely this sort of deviation. He held up the signature for me to see. It was undeniably Holmes's name, but the final swoop stretched far beyond the usual line, the pen's pressure weakening as it continued. "Now," he said, "imagine being asked to do that without context, without the benefit of knowing whether the document before you is real. What appears to be consent becomes nothing more than silent coercion." "Then it was murder," I said slowly. "Subtle, almost invisible, but murder." Holmes placed the pen down. "That is what I suspect. Clara may have administered nothing more than tension, pressure, and perhaps even threats. But the result was the same. Sir Clement signed something under false pretenses, and the stress may have hastened his death. Do you believe she intended for him to die?" "No," Holmes admitted. "I think she hoped he would live long enough for the will to pass unchallenged. But when he died days later, peacefully it seems, she buried the truth and secured her gains." A silence settled between us, broken only by the creak of the glass and the rustle of leaves beyond the conservatory wall. That evening, a carriage arrived from London carrying Inspector Lestrade and 2 representatives from the Crown Prosecution Service. They came not for ceremony, but for certainty. Holmes had been asked to present his findings in full, and I accompanied him to the library, where the men gathered around the large oak table like judges before an unseen court. Holmes laid out each element with the clarity of a surgeon. The inconsistencies in the handwriting, the irregularity of the signature length, the lack of ink blotting, the missing Marcus Aurelius book, the red ledger, the gardener's testimony, Clara's backup copy, and finally the handwritten statement of Thomas Lavington, confirming that he had helped her construct the will in secret. Then came the interpretation. "She believed she had fooled the world," Holmes said, "but every deception leaves behind residue. The forged will was too perfect. It incorporated the correct phrasing, knew the expected witnesses, and aligned with Clara's expectations, but it forgot the man himself. Sir Clement was not in the habit of changing his mind without reflection. He was precise, controlled, methodical. This document bore the traces of someone who mimicked his language but not his soul. One of the Crown men, a grave-looking barrister with silver sideburns, leaned forward. "Are you prepared to testify to this in court, Mr. Holmes?" "Without hesitation." The meeting lasted another hour, after which Lestrade accompanied Holmes and me to the front gate. "It's an unusual case," he admitted. "A forgery wrapped in consent, a death wrapped in natural causes. But the jury will see the manipulation for what it was." Holmes remained still. "Do you believe she meant to kill him?" Lestrade asked. Holmes stared out at the dark trees. "Number, but she pushed him to the edge and left him there. That is as close to guilt as a heart can carry." The inspector tipped his hat and climbed into the carriage. When it was gone, Holmes looked at me. "Come, Watson. There is one final thing I must do before we leave this place." "And what's that?" He gave me a soft smile. "Pay my respects to a man who suspected betrayal and still trusted that truth would one day find its way through." And so we walked in silence down the garden path, toward the place where the marble headstone caught the last of the fading light. The path to the cemetery behind Ashcroft House was narrow and overgrown, the morning dew still clinging to the grass, and leaves like a veil of glass. It wound through a small orchard of twisted apple trees, their bare branches scratching at the air, until it emerged beside a low stone wall mottled with lichen. Beyond that lay the modest resting place of generations of ashes, marked with headstones worn smooth by time and weather. Holmes and I crossed the threshold without a word. The only sounds were the quiet crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the gentle rustling of the wind through a broken yew. It was not a grand burial ground, nor a particularly somber one. It had the feel of something resigned, a corner of earth left to memory rather than mourning. Sir Clement's grave stood at the far end, beneath a wide cedar tree that cast a shifting shade across the marble. A single white rose had been placed at its base, fresh enough to have been set there within the last day. Holmes noticed it at once and crouched beside it. "She still remembers," he murmured. "Clara?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "It may have been left by one of the staff on her instruction, or possibly during her final hours of liberty before surrendering. Guilt, Watson, is not an emotion easily dismissed." I watched him carefully. There was something in his manner that was uncharacteristically tender, no less sharp, but weighted by reflection. Holmes had closed a case that most would consider straightforward once exposed. A forged will, a betrayed guardian, and a woman brought low by greed and fear. But for him, it was never just the puzzle. It was the ripple beneath the surface, the motive tucked behind the act. "She believed herself justified," he said after a moment, standing again. "She believed the years she spent by his side earned her what he would not give. And Lavington, he saw an opportunity to reinsert himself into her life, and perhaps the estates. Together, they constructed a narrative that nearly held. And Pendlebury?" Holmes turned to me. He saw only what he wished to see. He mistook proximity for trust. He wanted to believe in Clara's intentions because doubt would have forced him to act, and action requires courage. We stood in silence a moment longer. The wind stirred again, and the branches above whispered like a soft voice too distant to understand. "I've been thinking," I said at last, "about Sir Clement's peculiar final phrase. May it stand?" Pendlebury said those were his words after signing the will. Holmes nodded slowly. A strange turn of phrase. Formal, almost judicial. What did it mean? I believe it was a farewell to the original. He knew what he had signed was not right. Whether he had been coerced or deceived into it, he understood that something fundamental had shifted. But without the strength to resist, he let it pass. And with those words, he marked the act, left a breadcrumb for someone to follow. I shivered slightly, though the morning had warmed. Holmes turned away from the grave at last and began walking back toward the orchard. I followed, his coat brushing against tall grass, his stride steady but subdued. As we passed the iron gate and stepped into the trimmed lawn of the estate, we were met by Mrs. Halifax. She held a letter in her hand, her face etched with quiet concern. "This arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, offering the envelope. "Delivered by special courier not 10 minutes ago." Holmes accepted it and examined the seal. It bore the mark of Mortimer and Peabody. He broke the wax and unfolded the paper, scanning it in silence. Then he handed it to me. It was a brief correspondence from Mr. Vaughan, the solicitor. "Mr. Holmes, following your request, we conducted a thorough examination of our archives. Among Sir Clement Ash's deposited materials was an envelope, mistakenly overlooked until now. Inside was a single page bearing a dated statement, signed and witnessed, declaring his intent to dissolve his earlier will and issue a final testament, the contents of which matched the red ledger you discovered. This document, though unsigned formally, reinforces your findings and should prove invaluable in the formal hearing. Respectfully, R. Vaughan, Esquire." I looked up from the letter. Then that's it. Ironclad, as Lestrade said. Even without the formal will, his wishes are preserved, clearly and independently documented. Holmes gave the barest of smiles. A truth preserved not in marble or law, but in diligence and design. We returned to the study, where the red ledger still lay beneath the lock and key. Holmes unlocked the drawer and withdrew it one final time. He opened the final entry and read it aloud. "Should anything happen to me, I entrust this record to those who seek the truth without reward. There are things that cannot be proven in court, but may yet be understood in full by those who read carefully." He closed the book gently. "I believe," he said, Sir Clement wrote not to the courts, nor even to his heirs, but to the conscience of the investigator, a man who knows that truth and law do not always walk in step, but must meet when it matters most. Later that afternoon, we departed Ashcroft House for the final time. The groundskeeper, the cook, and even the old gardener gathered to bid us farewell. Pendlebury did not appear, though he sent word of his gratitude. He was to remain until the estate was formally transferred to the charitable institutions named in the Red Ledger, Sir Clement's true beneficiaries. As the train rolled southward toward London, I looked out the window at the fields passing by. Holmes sat opposite, his eyes closed, his fingers steepled, not in sleep but in thought. "Will you write about it?" he asked suddenly, without opening his eyes. I nodded. "I think I must." "Be kind," he said softly. "Not to me, but to her." "To Clara?" He opened his eyes then. "Yes. She fell from grace, but not from humanity. Let that be remembered." And with that, he closed his eyes again, the case concluded, the ink dry, and the truth, 3 inches longer than expected, forever recorded. It was some weeks later, mid-November, with the trees lining Baker Street reduced to bare limbs and the last leaves driven into the gutters by the city's ceaseless wind, when I set pen to paper to record the strange affair of Sir Clement Ash's final testament. The fire crackled warmly in our sitting room at 221B, and across from me, Holmes reclined in his armchair with the Times folded over his lap, his pipe balanced between his fingers, but unlit. He was not reading, nor did he appear lost in thought. Rather, he seemed content to allow the silence to fill the corners of the room, a silence not of boredom or melancholy, but of earned peace. The case had made no headlines. Though the forgery had technically been a matter of criminal interest, its exposure had been handled with delicacy. The court proceedings were conducted in private chambers, away from public spectacle, and the final verdict, confirming the invalidity of the contested will and the legitimacy of the Red Ledger's contents, was issued without ceremony. Miss Clara Whittingham, in light of her confession, the absence of direct physical harm, and her cooperation during the inquiry, was sentenced not to imprisonment but to 5 years of probation and voluntary residence abroad, away from the estate and its memories. Thomas Lavington, her co-conspirator, received a formal censure and was disbarred from practice. He too faded into obscurity, another clever man who mistook strategy for morality. I had returned from the last hearing only a day prior, having been asked to serve as a medical witness regarding Sir Clement's condition. I testified that, though heart disease could indeed claim a man quietly in his sleep, the psychological pressure he had been placed under in his final weeks might well have hastened the outcome. The court had taken that suggestion seriously. Holmes, for his part, had refused to attend. "You've already spoken all the truth the matter requires," I had said to him before departing. And truth, he'd replied, rarely improves with repetition. Now, seated together once more in our shared quarters, I was struck by the strangeness of it all, that a man's life could be turned, quietly and dangerously, not by violence or greed alone, but by the incremental erosion of trust. That a will, so symbolic of one's final authority, could be warped by inches, by strokes of ink and false signatures. That deception could arrive in such a civil manner. "It troubles you still," Holmes said suddenly, not looking up from the newspaper. "I'm not sure that it does," I replied, "only that it lingers." He gave the faintest smile. "Then it has left its mark." "I've been trying to understand," I continued, "what set this case apart. We've seen forgeries before, crimes of inheritance, but this one, there was something almost theatrical about the restraint." Holmes raised an eyebrow. The restraint was the performance. He tapped the bowl of his pipe gently against the edge of the ashtray. "You see, Watson, had Clara been more overt, had she altered the will more dramatically, seized control of the estate with greater ferocity, She would have attracted suspicion instantly, but she chose subtlety. A forged signature barely distinguishable from the real. A backup copy that was accurate but not ostentatious. A fabricated narrative that made just enough sense to withstand a casual glance. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice quiet. That is the genius of certain crimes. Not in their execution, but in their plausibility. I nodded slowly, and yet it was that very subtlety that unraveled it. Of course, Holmes said, because subtlety invites scrutiny, and because the human character, Watson, is not easily imitated. You can copy a signature, forge a clause, replicate ink, but you cannot forge a man's intentions without betraying something essential. We fell silent again, the fire popping softly as a draught whistled against the window pane. I thought of Sir Clement's grave, the single rose at its base, of Pendlebury's pale, drawn face as he accepted that he had played a role. Not in malice, but in cowardice. I thought of Clara, seated in that drawing room, her composure fraying by degrees as Holmes calmly dismantled the illusion she had built. Most of all, I thought of the ledger. "Do you think," I asked, "that Sir Clement knew we would find the ledger? That he left it for someone to uncover?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. He may not have known who would find it, but he knew someone must. He was not a man who relied on chance. He planned for contingency. The ledger was his insurance, not just against Clara, but against the erosion of memory. It was the quiet record of his justice. I let that sink in. Outside, the lamplighter's pole clinked gently against the gas jet as he moved past our window, and the warm glow returned to the street, pushing back against the long winter evening. There was one final piece I wished to understand. "Holmes," I said, "would you have exposed it all had Clara's forgery not been discovered? Had she succeeded without detection?" He met my gaze now, his eyes as clear and unreadable as ever. "Justice, Watson, is not a matter of victory. It is a matter of truth. Had she succeeded, someone else might have lived in the house, benefited from the lie, and believed themselves righteous. But the lie would remain. And lies, unchallenged, do not stay dormant. They calcify, they corrupt, they shape what comes next." He paused. "To reveal the truth is not to punish. It is to prevent." That, I knew, was the closest Holmes would come to expressing conviction. And so I let the matter rest. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I glanced once more at the manuscript I had begun drafting, the account of the case, its progression, and its strange resolution. I had titled it simply, "The Signature That Was 3 Inches Too Long." And I had chosen, as Holmes asked, to be kind. I had written of Clara, not as a villainess, but as a woman who crossed a line she believed justified, who mistook disappointment for betrayal and compensation for legacy. I wrote of Pendlebury as a man whose silence became a weapon in the hands of another. I wrote of Lavington, too clever by half, and of Sir Clement, who saw more than he spoke, and trusted that the truth would not be buried forever. And of Holmes. I wrote of Holmes as I always did, with wonder and with a slight measure of awe. For though the case had not ended with handcuffs or scandalous headlines, it had ended, as he so often insisted it should, with a simple, immutable line drawn between what was and what only seemed to be, and in that line, so much shorter than 3 inches, lay all the difference in the world.